You've spent all tier getting your character upgrades, so why not get yourself an upgrade IRL? Introducing the brand new Corsair Scimitar RGB Elite with the patented key slider control system. Micro your macros with code MISTEK at Corsair.com for 10% off your order. Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Cinder's Drift Extreme. This is the new Extreme trial made available by patch 5.2 in Final Fantasy XIV, Echoes of a Fallen Star. When you Atlas get it clear, this encounter is sure to leave an impact on your greater memory. My name is MISTEK and I'll be your trial guide. Optimized Ultima will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers be ready with those shields and heals. Magitek bit will cause a number of bits to spawn around the outer edge of the arena. These bits will target long line attacks onto random players. Players will need to dodge these as necessary. Immediately after, the boss will move into the center of the platform and cast FFXIV, starting the first mini phase. HELICOCLAW will spawn 3 large circle AoEs inside the boss's hitbox and 3 long yellow lines indicating the future pathing of these AoE circles. Once the cast goes off, these circles will very quickly explode along the 3 lines towards the outer edge of the platform. This leaves very narrow specific safe zones that players will need to move into between each path to avoid excess damage and debuffs. However, the Magitek bits are still messing around and will continue to target players for line AoEs during this time. To handle this combo safely, players will first need to bait the Magitek lines away from the HELICOCLAW safe zones. Once the line telegraphs appear, players are then free to move into the safe spots. There will be 4 total Magitek line attacks and 2 rounds of HELICOCLAW before the boss resumes its attacks. Next up, the primary tank will be hit with Stamp. This is a heavy hitting tank buster that also applies a blunt resist down debuff, forcing a tank swap. Don't forget your cooldowns. The boss will then begin another FFXIV mini phase. RAVENSCLAW will cause 8 cracks to form from the center of the boss towards each cardinal and intercardinal point. You'll notice that these cracks will alternate short and long, with all long towards the cardinals and all short towards the intercardinals, or vice versa. Towards the end of RAVENSCLAW, a point-blank AoE circle will form underneath the boss and each tip of the cracks, the sections that were last to form, and will then explode in wide AoE circles. The telegraphs for all of these attacks are very minimal compared to normal mode, and you may find that it's pretty hard to see the incoming exploding red cracks before it's too late. An easy way to handle this is to move on top of any of the long cracks at the junction of it and the boss's hitbox. This specific area will always be safe from the explosions, no matter the orientation. Immediately after, the boss will either cast Liquefaction or Undermine. This first cast is random, so be ready for either variation. If you see him casting Liquefaction, the entire platform, except for the cracks, will turn to quicksand and quickly destroy any player caught out in the open. If you see him casting Undermine, various circle explosions will cover every inch of the cracks, forcing players into the open areas. Regardless of which cast he first uses, all players will then be marked with these red circles. This attack will deal damage to the player, afflict them with a magic vulnerability up debuff, and leave behind a persistent red mine that will explode if anyone touches it. Oh, and all players will drop 3 of these in a row. To avoid instant death here, all players must spread out in their available safe spots and drop all 3 of their mines in a very controlled manner. During Liquefaction, the only safe spaces available are on the cracks themselves. Since the red mines are pretty massive, each player is incredibly limited on where they can drop their markers. To easily handle this, all players will be assigned a cardinal or intercardinal position. I would recommend having all tanks and melee players assigned to either the cardinal or intercardinal, while all ranged and healers are assigned to the other. This allows for a simple rotation clockwise if the melee find themselves on a long crack, allowing them to maintain uptime by rotating over to a short crack. With everyone assigned a specific position around the platform, all players can pre-position before this mini phase begins. Once Liquefaction starts casting, each player can stand on the very tip of their crack to drop their first orb. All players will then carefully move along their crack, be it short or long, until they reach the edge of their dropped mine to drop the second mine. They will do this again for the third mine. Carefully dropping mines along the trajectory of their crack will give players all the room necessary to avoid overlap or trapping players into unsafe spots. Once all 3 mines are dropped, players can then safely meet up in the middle underneath the boss. If the boss is casting Undermine instead, all players will need to move away from their cracks. Again, with the pre-positioning, players will be evenly split into each quadrant that forms, so you'll have plenty of space to work with. In this variation, all players will have the open space between the cracks to drop off their mines. After the first one drops, move to its edge to drop the next. You want to minimize the area each mine affects the platform. Once all 3 mines are dropped, you'll have a few seconds before the platform returns to normal. Next, the boss will face a random target and cast Ruby Ray, a massive frontal attack. All players will need to move behind the boss to avoid getting blasted. You'll have another optimized Ultima Blast to heal through before the next FFXIV mini phase. Here, the boss will immediately cast Liquefaction, turning the outer edges of the platform to quicksand. All players will need to move into the center to avoid death. The boss will then fly to a random point on the edge and begin to cast RAVENSFLIGHT. If you look around the platform, you'll see arrows indicating his incoming pathing. The boss will always fly first into the middle and then choose to go either left or right. All players will need to quickly identify this first pattern of movement and position themselves out of the way. Just as in normal, his hitbox is deceivingly massive and players will need to squeeze themselves right against the edge of that safe zone away from his trajectory to avoid getting clipped. Once the boss passes you, it'll pause at this claw marker. You'll notice one of his claws start to glow and get really big. This will indicate the unsafe side of the boss for the remainder of his trajectory. An easy way to handle this is to move into the middle of the platform after the first flyby and look directly at him to identify which side is unsafe. Then, move immediately to the safe side. As you're moving, look around and identify the last arrow indicator and then find the safe side of the boss relative to that final marker. This will show you the final safe zone that all players need to aim for. In the final trajectory of his flight, the boss will hit the quicksand marker, which will cause the platform to form quicksand in the opposite pattern. As you move into the safe zone to avoid the claw, make sure you move out of the middle to avoid the quicksand as well. At this point, the boss will return to the platform and the encounter resumes. Shield and heal through another optimized ultima, and tanks will then need to swap for the next stamp attack. When the boss teleports to the north or south edge and begins to cast Ruby Dynamics, all players will need to move into his hitbox to avoid the room-wide cleave. At the same time, each healer will be targeted for high-powered homing laser stack-up markers, and the group will need to split evenly to share this incoming damage. The 2 groups need to also ensure they stay away from one another to avoid overlap, so one will go to the left inside of the hitbox while the other stacks up on the right. Immediately after, all players will be targeted by circle AoE markers, and the boss will begin to cast Cut and Run. This attack will have the boss charging through the center of the platform all the way to the other side, throwing out massive frontal cleaves as he goes. All players will need to move to the edges of the platform to avoid getting hit by the boss. Since they're all also targeted for homing lasers, each player will need to spread along the edge to avoid overlap. To keep positioning consistent, players can split along the edges in the same groups they took their homing laser stack in. Immediately after, 2 proximity-based markers will appear in the east and west of the platform, forcing all players back into the north or south to avoid excess damage. Another Ruby Ray will have players dodging behind the boss to avoid death, followed by another optimized ultima to heal through. The boss will then teleport into the center and begin another FFXIV phase. This RAVENSCLAW will have cracks forming again from underneath the boss towards each cardinal point, and the boss will either cast either Liquefaction or Undermine, whichever attack wasn't cast in the first mini phase. Remember to drop all 3 mines in a controlled manner in whatever safe space is available to you. Once all 3 mines are down and the platform returns to normal, the boss will cast another Ruby Ray and another optimized ultima. This final FFXIV mini phase will have the boss casting Liquefaction and causing the middle of the platform to form quicksand. All players will be forced to the outer edges for the next RAVENSFLIGHT. This time, his trajectory will always lead him to the quicksand marker first, so players will need to dodge his initial movement and be ready to move back into the center once he hits that marker and changes the location of the quicksand. The boss will then hit his claw marker and players can identify which side becomes unsafe. Move to the safe side to avoid death. Another optimized ultima before the boss teleports to the center and begins an enrage cast. You'll need to destroy him in this time to move on to the next phase. Depending on your group's damage, you can skip any of these later phase mechanics. After a long cutscene, the next phase of the fight begins. This cutscene acts like a checkpoint, and if you wipe from here on out, you will restart the encounter on this phase. As soon as the boss is pulled, Meteor Project will cast and Dalamed will begin to reform in the background. This will eventually do massive raid-wide damage on a set timer, but can be ignored for now. Negative Personae will render the boss invulnerable and target all players with either an orange Pall of Rage debuff or a blue Pall of Grief debuff. 2 Raven's Image ads will also appear on the platform with their own version of these debuffs. Players will only be able to deal damage to the ad of the opposite debuff or color. If you find that the ad you're targeting isn't vulnerable, then you're targeting the incorrect one. Each tank will grab their ad and keep them on the east and west sides of the platform. If they get too close, they'll tether together and become immune to damage. First, Meteor Stream will target all damage dealers with these circle markers. Affected players will need to move away from one another to avoid overlapping damage. This hits pretty hard, so healers beware. The 2 ads will then cast Greater Memory, buffing themselves up with a stack of damage up. They will then both cast either Iron Chariot, a point-blank AoE circle around the ad, or Lunar Dynamo, a large donut attack in any possible combo. To handle this, the players will need to pay attention to their particular ad and move accordingly. Since the 2 ads are being kept far apart in the east and the west, staying close to your ad will naturally help you dodge the attacks from the other ad across the platform. Just be careful to dodge your ad's Iron Chariots towards the north or the south to avoid getting clipped by the other side. At the same time, the boss is casting Negative Effect, which will spawn 1 blue and 1 orange head that will tether to the 2 furthest players from them. If a player touches these ads, they will explode and you will die. These heads must be dragged into the Raven's Image ads of the opposite color to destroy them. Doing so will also remove the stacking damage up buff from the Raven's Images. While the heads slowly make their way to their targets, damage dealers will again need to spread apart for Meteor Stream. Up next, each ad will target their tanks with Ruby Claw, 5 heavy hits in quick succession. Be sure to cool down and heal through this as necessary. The boss will then cast Change of Heart, causing the debuffs on each ad to swap to the opposite color. If the ads are not dead before this time, the tanks will need to quickly swap targets to maintain their position on the platform, and all players will need to switch targets to continue their attacks. These ad phase mechanics can repeat here until the ads are destroyed. Once the ads are down, you may resume your attack on the boss. Negative Aura is a gaze attack that all players will need to look away from. Getting hit by this will confuse your character and potentially kill you by running you into a wall. Around this time, Dalamid will fall in the background, dealing massive raid-wide damage. Be ready with raid cooldowns, shields, and heals. Another Meteor Project cast will again reform Dalamid for another AoE after a set time. Meteor Mine will mark up all players with a meteor marker numbered from 1 to 8. These markers will call down small meteors under players that will deal proximity-based damage in order from 1 to 8 that will persist for some time before exploding in the same order. Immediately after, the boss will cast Magitek Meteor, which will call down a massive meteor in the center of the platform that will destroy anything it hits. To easily handle this combo, all players will utilize the same assigned cardinal and intercardinal positions from the first phase. Players 1 through 7 will drop their meteors at their positions on the outer edge of the platform. As soon as your numbered meteor marker disappears, a proximity-based damage marker will form beneath you and you'll have time to move into the center to reduce damage. The 8th meteor player has the responsibility to drop their meteor slightly away from the wall, or better yet, on the boss's hitbox to allow for melee uptime. However, be aware that the closer your meteor falls to the boss, the more damage you'll take in the center, so be ready with those heals and shields. This final 8th meteor will be what the group uses to hide from the Magitek meteor falling to the center of the platform. Before that happens, the boss will cast Screech, which will knock back all players a set distance from the center. The timing on this is incredibly tight, and players will need to get knocked back in the direction of the final meteor to then immediately hide behind it for the blast. Alternatively, you can use your knockback immunity and manually position yourself behind that meteor and avoid the knockback completely. As soon as the damage from the massive Magitek meteor is avoided, all players will need to move away from the 8th meteor before it explodes to avoid excess damage. Immediately after, Mark II Magitek meteor will form 2 moving circle AoEs around the platform. These circle AoEs will move in the direction indicated by their arrows before finally settling on the platform. The 2 tanks will need to stand in these circles once they settle to hold back the incoming comets. If a comet is allowed to fall to the platform, you will die. The rest of the group will need to destroy each comet on the tanks, while the healers keep them alive. Tanks can also pop cooldowns before getting under each comet to minimize damage. During this time, Bradamante will target 2 players with orange markers each time. Soon after, long column attacks will shoot out from the boss in their direction. These players must make sure that they angle these attacks away from the comet tanks or you will die. Around this time, the second fall of Dalamid will occur, so get ready for some heavy damage to heal through. One final Meteor Project cast will form Dalamid again. This timer marks the final enrage, so you'll need to destroy the boss as quickly as possible. The boss will then cast 2 rounds of Outrage, dealing high raid-wide damage. Healers buyers beware. Immediately after, Meteor Stream will target either all DPS or all tanks and healers, spread apart to avoid overlap. The second round of Meteor Stream will target the other 4 players. Another 2 outrage casts to heal through before Dalamid falls one final time. You'll need to destroy the ruby weapon before this time or the phase resets. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into the Savage versions of Eden's Verse. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.